This video is sponsored by Bombas. I've been a fan of Bombas for years now, so when they reached out, I absolutely jumped on the opportunity. Their socks like these are an absolute game changer. Built-in arch support, no annoying toe seams, and premium materials like merino wool and extra long staple cotton make you feel ready to tackle just about anything, be it walking, running, or even just kicking back and relaxing. But here's what stood out to me most. Bombas is a purpose-driven brand. Socks are the #1 most requested clothing item in shelters, and for every pair that you purchase, Bombas donates one to someone in need. Same goes for the #2 and 3 most requested items, underwear and t-shirts, which Bombas also makes and gladly donates each time you buy. Over the years, they've donated more than 100 million clothing items to people experiencing homelessness, working with 3,500 plus giving partners across the US, and as someone who grew up experiencing much the same thing on and off, this point is extremely important to me. Now, every purchase is backed by their 100% happiness guarantee, so if you're not in love with your socks or whatever items they may be for some reason, Bombas will have you covered with free returns and exchanges. Feel good and do good with Bombas. New customers can get 20% off their first purchase by going to bombas.com/reignbot and using promo code REIGNBOT at checkout. Again, that's bombas.com/reignbot and code REIGNBOT for 20% off. Silent Hill 2 left me with feelings that I'm finding hard to articulate even weeks after I played the game. In fact, while I could have released this video much sooner when it would have been more beneficial for the algorithm, I'm sure, I wanted to take some time to just let things settle in my head. I wanted some time to process the experience because, if I'm being honest, at one point it felt as though this game broke me. I want to preface this by saying that Silent Hill 2 Remake was my first ever experience with any Silent Hill game, but that's not to say that I haven't been keenly aware of its legacy. Being a lifelong horror fan and someone that grew up in the 2000s, it was impossible to not know the name Silent Hill, to not know the immense love and reverence that there was in particular for the franchise's sophomore entry. It was impossible to not know who Pyramid Head was, and it seemed like every convention I attended contained at least a couple cosplayers dressed up as the almost equally iconic Bubblehead nurses. Now, having said all this, it begs the question of why I never played Silent Hill 2 back when the original was making its rounds, and honestly, it's just due to lack of accessibility. As some of you already know, I spent the 2000s in the Philippines, where I primarily lived in the countryside, and while we did have a PS2, the only games that we had came to us via relatives still living in the States that would pick up things to send us at random. Unfortunately, Silent Hill was never one of them. By the 2010s, I was living in the US yet again, but as many horror fans can attest to, Silent Hill 2 really wasn't very accessible by that period of time. I was told that I'd have to emulate it or just settle for a subpar version, neither of which I really felt compelled to do. Fast forward to 2024. I'm now nearly 3 decades old, never having played any Silent Hill title, and this remake finally comes out. A game that I didn't get to play immediately due to other obligations. In that initial release period, though, I was left to ask friends and family who had played the original if they thought that the remake fully respected its source material, if they thought that Team Bloober understood Silent Hill 2. And to my utter shock, the answer was yes. I got the impression that they too were pleasantly surprised. With that worry out of the way, I was fully aware of the magnitude of what I was about to walk into. Sure, it's just a video game, but it's one that I've watched people praise over and over again for 2 decades. Its legacy and influence was undeniable. I expected a great experience. I expected to feel scared. I expected to be enthralled by twists and turns, but what I did not expect was just how deeply personal this journey would be for me. I spent many hours grappling with how to approach this video, about what angle would be most appropriate. At first, I considered coming at it purely like any review or analysis, but at the same time I felt that that was impossible. At least for me. The themes in Silent Hill 2 are incredibly heavy, and despite taking place in this sort of nightmare world, the story really is about people. It's one that lends itself to and maybe even encourages self-reflection and contemplation from those who choose to engage with its narrative. I, like many other people, love interacting with fiction as a means of escapism. Instead of thinking about life, we lose ourselves in this tale that's unfolding before us. While I can really only speak to my own experience, playing Silent Hill 2 almost felt like the opposite of escapism. Rather than forgetting my own life and experiences for the 18 or so hours it took me on my first playthrough, I instead found myself looking back at my own life, be it my own direct experiences or those of people around me. This level of introspection is unlike anything I've ever had in any game experience, and it made me feel all the more invested in Silent Hill 2 as a work of art. This was all a very long-winded way of saying that I personally felt that there was something self-centered about me making a video talking about this game, as well as my own experiences, but at the same time, there was something that didn't sit right with me about leaving the personal element out, because with many who experience Silent Hill 2, that component feels almost unavoidable. One admittedly sort of shallow question that I had when finally booting up Silent Hill 2 Remake was how scary it would be. It's a question that naturally surfaces every single time any piece of media labeled horror is brought into this world. We equate scariness to inherent value, and one of the most common criticisms of any piece of horror media on the planet is, "I don't get it, it wasn't even scary." And for every comment like this, you might hear the next person talk about how the exact same thing kept them awake at night. As a lifelong horror fan, I try my hardest to avoid these comments. Horror, just like any art, is subjective. People have said this a million times before me because, well, it's true. What's also true is that the horror genre is incredibly diverse. I love The Ring, which I consider to be genuinely scary, but I also love characters like Chucky and Art the Clown. To me, the value in horror isn't always if it makes me turn on all the lights to go to the bathroom at night. And I'd like to think of myself as above all this discourse, but regardless, I'm still human, and so as I walk down the hills, through the woods, and into Silent Hill, I still had it in the back of my mind. How scary is this really going to be? I will say right away I felt alert. I had the lights in my room off and my headphones on, and I could hear these unnerving sounds surround me from within the woods. I'd turn around every so often just to make sure that I wasn't going to be ambushed. The town itself was quiet, eerily quiet, of course sporting that iconic Silent Hill fog that I'd heard so much about. I loved the atmosphere, how somber and abandoned everything felt. By the time I'd make my way to the apartments and explored a bit, I recall a certain thought. I told myself that this wasn't so bad, that I could handle this, and perhaps this wasn't going to be as overtly scary as I expected. I also remember thinking that the apartments weren't nearly as rotten and hellish as I expected them to be. Little did I know, that's because I simply hadn't reached that point in the game yet, but there was something else entirely that stuck out to me as the hours progressed. The deeper I got into Silent Hill, the more entranced I got by it. By the time I was settled into the other world, it felt as though a weight was slowly building upon my shoulders, as though I was getting myself into a sort of negative headspace. This was absolutely not because I wasn't enjoying the game, I very much was, but where I started out feeling completely normal, there were little things that would slowly chip away at that. There was silence, then there were sounds, be it the sudden static from my radio as enemies drew near, or the seemingly random, disembodied, quick breaths of air that sounded like a gasp. There were creaks, the sounds of dripping. It almost wasn't even the presence of enemies that got to me, but rather these suffocating environments paired with sound design that was slowly causing me mental fatigue and a heightened sense of anxiety. As if that wasn't enough, what really seemed to send me over was the ambient music. These particular tracks are from various points in the game, but nonetheless, they are great examples of songs that made me feel like I was losing my mind. Their constant and relentless droning put me in sort of a dissociative state, and that's because these sound a lot like what I actually hear in my head during particularly difficult moments. It's something I've never really been able to externalize or properly explain. I've had a long history with mental health struggles, as some of you already know, of course, and while these sorts of sounds don't appear very often these days, they still tend to emerge when I'm in the darkest state of mind, one where everything else falls away and I almost feel out of body. My face will settle on this blank expression as I stare at the ground, unable to really gather my thoughts, as it's almost as though I can't hear myself or anything else over the droning in my head that's now taken over. Up until now, I really hadn't heard anything quite like it manifested outside of my head, and while these tracks are not identical to them, they're the closest things to it I've ever heard. Needless to say, they're very distressing to me, which in turn made the game all the much more terrifying. Once I got to this point in the game, the point where my mental state started to warp, I realized that I was experiencing a different kind of horror from any that I've ever experienced before, and this was before I was even presented with the deeper thematic elements that would eventually emerge. I didn't feel scared in the traditional sense. Don't get me wrong, that was definitely there, but something about this was already deeply intimate, leaving no place for me to hide. I felt somehow personally exposed and vulnerable, and I can only assume that state of mind left me primed for when I'd finally get short breaks from roaming the halls. That, of course, would come in the form of very character-driven cutscenes and interactions.
We're all the same.
I'm not like you.
Eddie is the character that I wanted to start off with for one main reason. He's who I felt the least empathetic to in my first playthrough. Once the credits rolled, he was by far the one I thought about the least, and as much as I hate to say it, I almost wondered if his issues were trivial compared to those of Angela and James, which of course I felt terrible for thinking. Upon further contemplation, I realized that my disconnect when it came to Eddie really came down to my lack of ability to fully and directly relate to him. Don't get me wrong, I definitely grew up with bullying, be it for having a stutter as I grew up or due to my gender expression, but for one reason or another, those particular experiences fell on the back burner for me. That's not to say that they weren't traumatic, because they were. I just had certain other experiences in life that I obsessed over and maybe focused on to the point of neglecting to address these other very real parts of my past. I had to reach a bit to get Eddie, as certain very obvious things about his character seemed to just fly over my head during my first run. For example, I did notice Eddie's breath, and the fact that no one else's breath was visible, at least in this scene. I also noticed that the bodies we'd see around him always seemed to be frozen, which still didn't make me think twice once I finally had my final showdown with him in the meat freezer. Meanwhile, Angela's world being engulfed in flames made sense to me immediately. It was only when thinking about this later that it clicked, and I felt entirely stupid for not realizing that Eddie's version of Silent Hill was probably the opposite of Angela's, a hellscape that had frozen over, seemingly alluding to his isolation and loneliness. My eventual interpretation of Eddie was that he was this guy who was alone for the most part, and whenever people were around him, they could not be bothered at all to treat him like a human being. Years and years of being treated like trash would eventually cause Eddie to snap, and once I realized this, I finally found that personal element to help me empathize with his character. I realized that Eddie, in some ways, reminded me in part of certain people that I used to know. People I grew up with who I consider my closest friends back in those days. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more personal it became. Some of you already know this, but 2 of my good friends from high school are serving time in prison for murder. These were different cases that happened in different states with no connection whatsoever to each other, but needless to say, I no longer have any communication with these individuals. What I do carry with me is this weird sense of survivor's guilt. My particular friend group back in those days were made up of other kids from rough backgrounds. We at times were homeless together, and we all knew about one another's pasts and what we were running away from. I got the impression that they were just as desperate as I was to escape, to the point where sleeping under bridges was preferable to sleeping in our own beds. I would not feel comfortable outlining all the terrible things that happened to these friends of mine, but what I will say is that every adult in the room had let them down. And had they gotten the help that they so desperately needed, I could see a world where things went differently. At the same time, however, my friends ultimately chose to do what they did, and in many ways, this choice meant the end of their own lives as well. In the same sense, there's this impression that Eddie wasn't born this unhinged, because of course he wasn't. No one is. In fact, when we first see him in Silent Hill, he's much more grounded than what we'd see later on in the meat freezer. By the end, Eddie seems to have given in, the self-hatred and rage consuming him to the point of no return. He didn't seem to see a path where he could be a better person, and instead essentially gave up, effectively allowing those who wronged him to continue to hold all the power. The way I see it, Eddie was told so many times how worthless he was that eventually he started to believe it himself.
Maybe he was right. Maybe I am nothing but a fat, disgusting piece of shit. But you know what? It doesn't matter if you're smart, dumb, ugly, pretty. It's all the same once you're dead. And a corpse can't laugh!
Angela. For me, she was the exact opposite of Eddie in terms of my ability to empathize and identify with the character. Unfortunately, I already knew a little bit about her backstory before playing the game due to running into spoilers, but I wasn't aware of the details. I knew that Angela had endured some level of abuse before arriving in Silent Hill, but beyond that, I really had no clue what her story entailed. When James first meets Angela right at the top of the game, I took note of how she appeared to be a young adult, but still referred to her mother as Mama. What this told me right then and there is that there was some kind of unhealthy level of dependence that she had on her mother, or perhaps her parents in general. She was also bizarrely apologetic.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry. I was just...
Hey, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you.
Now, why would Angela apologize in this situation when there's really nothing she could have been doing that was wrong? And why apologize to James specifically? It's not like she was trespassing on his property or anything like that. As someone who has a tendency to apologize in much the same way, that being when I don't need to or should not apologize, my reasons for doing this seem to be rooted in childhood trauma. This need to kind of quickly apologize before the other person suddenly flies off the rails, even if such a reaction would not be warranted at all. I also have a tendency to almost reflexively blame myself for anything and everything. Again, another product of growing up being blamed for things that, as an adult, I now understand were not my fault at all. It's something I try to remind myself not to do, even at the ripe age of 29. Just from this scene alone, it was obvious that Angela had gone through some fairly severe trauma in her formative years. The next cutscene with Angela is the iconic one where James finds her on the floor in front of a mirror. She's got this monotone voice that makes it sound like she's disconnected from reality in a way, which is only augmented by the use of strange angles as well as this piano score playing in the background. What stood out to me here was Angela's choice to not team up with James, despite how dangerous the town is.
Should I go with you? This town really is dangerous. Now I know what you meant back there in the cemetery.
No, it's okay. Besides, I'd just slow you down.
"I'd just slow you down" was an interesting choice of words. On the one hand, you could see this as Angela maybe not trusting James and not wanting to be around him, and on the other, you could also see this as Angela legitimately believing that she's of no value here, or perhaps not even worth protecting. I think a lot of people who have dealt with trauma, myself included, have a near impossible time either asking for or accepting help. Then, there's what happens once Angela does finally ask for a favor.
What about
Will you hold it for me?
Sure. No problem.
If I kept it, I'm not sure what I might do. No! I'm sorry! I've been bad! Please don't!
Angela asks James to hold her knife because she's not sure what she'd do if she kept it. What she meant by this isn't fully clarified, but when James reaches out to take the knife, like she asked, she gets startled, then seems to get upset at herself for how she reacted, and finally runs off. Again, this is something that I definitely identify with as well. There have been many times in my life where my body has involuntarily reacted a certain way to someone non-threatening, and that involuntary action, the lack of control, is frustrating and embarrassing. Like, no matter how much you work through symptoms of PTSD, it can sometimes still manifest when you least expect it. I can't speak for Angela, but for me, these moments have brought feelings of guilt, anger, shame, and just this very misplaced idea of wishing I was normal, whatever that means. Now, at this point in time, I still couldn't know for sure exactly what happened to Angela, even if I related to it enough to be able to guess what was to come. We get another similar reaction from Angela later in Rosewater Park, where she seems normal up until the point where James asks her about a little girl and then reaches out for her.
A little girl?
Yeah, Angela? Are you alright? Angela?
No. Please. You shouldn't be here.
Angela, it's okay.
No, don't touch me!
The next time that James runs into Angela is within the walls of the labyrinth. This section comes after the prison and suddenly puts us into what seems to be a warped version of some kind of residential building. Faint whispers can be heard through the walls, and while I tried, I was not able to make out what they said. Eventually, we hear Angela's voice crying out in distress, and when we finally find her, this happens.
Be good, I promise. Tell him I'll be good, please.
Angela? Angela, it's me.
No, please. Daddy!
This, as I am sure you are all aware, is the abstract daddy, and at least for me, he's probably the most memorable boss in the entire game. It comes out of nowhere, chasing you down these maze-like halls that are presumably projections of Angela's childhood home, at one point allowing you to hide in a closet-like area lined with newspapers. And to many victims of similar tragedies, this type of space is all too familiar. Eventually, this already dread-filled setting becomes even more warped and twisted, the walls turning into flesh, accented with machinery, rhythmically pumping away as you continue to fight this thing. The metaphor here wasn't lost on me, and I personally really enjoyed how at first this looked like a relatively normal home, at least by Silent Hill standards, but the deeper you dive into it, the more the truth behind this facade would slowly reveal itself. Once James defeats the abstract daddy, Angela starts to kick as well as throw a whole box TV on it. Something that for me was probably the most satisfying moment in this entire game, even more satisfying than taking this thing down myself while playing as James. I got the impression that this was the first time Angela ever got to do something like this, to act out against this person who hurt her. Nonetheless, this next piece of dialogue is nothing short of utterly heartbreaking.
It's okay. It's over.
Don't even try.
Try what?
Like you don't know. I see what you're doing. It's always the same with you. You're only after one thing.
Angela, please.
You don't have to lie. Go ahead. Say it. Or you could just force me. Like he always did. You disgusting pig.
I do have a few thoughts on this scene. Angela talks in a way that's accusatory towards James. She says, you this, you that, you're all the same, or you could just force me like he always did. I'm not sure what the wider Silent Hill community has made of this, or if there's any official explanation, but to me it sounds like the you here isn't specifically James, but rather men as a whole. Angela seems to be reliving her trauma in this moment. This entire sequence in the labyrinth with Angela and Abstract Daddy, it confirmed for me what I already suspected from the start, that being Angela's history with CSA at the hands of her own family member, specifically her father. From what I understand, it's also widely agreed upon that her brother was also another perpetrator, but I may have missed some clues about that in my playthroughs. The final scene with Angela is probably my absolute favorite, and just honestly left me feeling completely hollow. James finds Angela on a burning staircase, the walls on either side of her bearing what looks a lot like Abstract Daddy, but broken into two pieces, and seemingly with certain, for lack of a better term, pieces missing. Angela mistakes James for her mother, but soon realizes said mistake.
Mama. What's wrong? Wait. You're not my mama. It's you.
Sorry, Angela. I think you were right. What we're looking for, it's not here. Not anymore.
Thank you for helping me earlier. But I wish you hadn't. Even Mama said it. I deserve what happened.
No, Angela, that is not true.
This part in particular really stung, when after all this time it becomes clear that the one person Angela seemed to be searching for some comfort actually blamed her for what her father did. This of course is all too common in the real world too, as disgusting as it is. Once again, it's something that I identify with, although my situation was slightly different. I had actually kept my own CSA a secret into my teenage years until it was outed to my mother by someone that I had broken up with. This was his idea of getting back at me for leaving him. My mother never said it was my fault, but instead of supporting me, she became angry and chose to yell at me for reasons I still don't fully comprehend, but I suspect alcohol was involved. In my case, the perpetrator was not my father, but nonetheless, I'm sure every child would want their mother to react in a loving and supporting manner to something so serious. In a way, Not having the support of loved ones in a situation like this is almost as devastating as the original act itself, at least for me. This was the most alone I ever felt up until that point in my life, and I can imagine that Angela might be feeling quite the similar way.
It's hot as hell in here.
You see it too? For me, it's always like this.
Now, here's the part where I admit possibly the single most tragic element about my Silent Hill 2 experience, and before I say it, for the love of all that is sacred, if you have not played this game yourself and you don't want any more spoilers, click away now, okay? Okay. So, the single issue that had me the most worried going into my first time playing Silent Hill 2 was the fact that I already knew that James killed Mary. What sucks about this even more than it already did was the fact that I somehow managed to completely avoid this spoiler for the better part of 2 decades, and it wasn't until literally just a couple of years ago that my brother and I were having a random conversation about horror stuff when he goes, quote, something something and James killed Mary. And basically, he stopped mid-sentence at that point because I'm sure the look on my face clearly indicated that I somehow missed the spoiler that was nearly the same age as the person who just delivered it to me. Now, there was perhaps a silver lining here. Yes, I knew that James killed Mary, but I didn't know how James killed Mary, or why. For all I knew, Silent Hill 2 was the story of a man who accidentally killed his wife and felt guilty over it. By the time I booted up the remake, I still had no idea what was going to happen. My first impression of James was that he seemed genuinely sympathetic, and also seemed to truly want to find Mary. I'd heard some comments online paint James as this totally unlikable monster, but what I was seeing throughout the many hours of the game wasn't that at all, at least not on the surface. Whoever James was, he seemed like a normal guy with a basic sense of right and wrong, who really just wanted to find his wife, despite the fact that she was apparently already dead. Again, based on how this was all going, I had a hard time reconciling the fact that this character would willingly kill his wife, and was at least in part still convinced that Mary's death was going to turn out to be accidental. After all, James himself spoke out against violence when interacting with Eddie. He told Angela that what happened to her wasn't her fault, and despite Maria's pretty heavy flirting, he never chose to give up on trying to find Mary. Plus, from a writing perspective, making Mary's death an accident would make James impossibly sympathetic. It would be a tragedy all around, an almost melodramatic one at that, an ending that I could absolutely see people holding on to for decades after. Once I found myself on Toluca Lake, rowing towards the Lakeview Hotel, it began to dawn on me that this was most likely where James, and by extension the player, would be ending their journey. It felt exciting to walk up to this bright, immaculate building after hours in dark, rusty, fog-filled places like the prison, labyrinth, hospital, etc. It felt as though this light would bring with it revelation, and oh boy, it absolutely did. After playing Silent Hill 2 Remake a couple more times, I've come to realize that this is probably my favorite part of the entire game. Everything about this finale was one gut punch after another, and by the time the credits rolled each time, I felt almost tearful and immensely satisfied all at once. As you probably already know, the hotel plays out a lot like the other areas, in that you need to collect items and eventually solve a central puzzle, in this case being this music box, which gives you access to a previously locked area of the 3rd floor. This is really your final task in terms of normal gameplay, and everything after is just this truth gauntlet that happens in really quick succession. There's something absolutely chilling to me about the music that plays here. This eerie, playful, melancholy little tune that stays the same volume even as you get further and further away from it. The only time the song stops is when you reach the fabled room 312, where there's nothing left to do but watch the infamous videotape.
Are you taping again? Come on. I don't know why, but I just love it here. It's so peaceful. You know what I heard? This whole area used to be a sacred place. I think I can see why. It's too bad we have to leave. Promise you'll take me again, James.
I barely know what to say right now. Again, just based on how the game played out up until this point, I thought that they were going for James not truly having been at fault. Like, I don't know, maybe him and Mary getting into a car accident or something, or maybe James having not been able to move fast enough to save Mary when she had one final medical emergency due to her illness. What I did not expect was James to straight up smother his already weak and dying wife, arguably in cold blood. My first impression upon seeing this tape was shock, but I was also impressed that the writers would have their protagonist do such an unspeakably evil deed. Now, I was obviously left wondering why. Why exactly did James kill Mary? The walk through the hotel after watching the tape is something that will always stick with me. It's the otherworld version of the hotel, from what I understand, but it's not overtly scary. In fact, the main emotion this evokes in me is grief or a sense of death. It's something about how everything looks more burnt or moldy instead of rusted, and instead of the dead of night, we have the soft glow of golden hour illuminating our surroundings. Whether that's a sunrise or sunset is unclear, at least to me. Even more bizarre, though, is how the monsters here no longer fight, and instead they cower away as James draws near, making me feel almost sorry for them. While Pyramid Head does put up one last fight, it's clear by the end of this that James no longer needs this monster either. Of course, after this double Pyramid Head fight is the long hallway with Mary's disembodied voice speaking to James in a, let's just say, unfriendly way.
What do you want, James? Flowers? I don't want any damn flowers. Just go home already. Look at me. I'm disgusting. Between the disease and the drugs, I look like a monster. Well, what are you looking at? Get the hell out of here. Leave me alone already. I'm no use to anyone. I'll be dead soon anyway. It'd be easier if they just killed me. But I guess the hospital's making a nice profit off of me. Why are you still here? I told you to go. Are you deaf? Don't come back. James.
So I mentioned this to people that I know, but I'm almost glad that I didn't get to play Silent Hill 2 until this phase of my life, because had I played this back in the 2000s, I would not have been able to appreciate just how complex and deeply troubling its themes really are. Now, Mary's perspective in all this is explored a little bit more depending on which ending you get, but just based on this speech in the hallway alone, I already felt like I was beginning to truly understand what had happened to Mary and James' relationship after she had gotten sick. Here, she alludes to all the pain she's in, both physical and psychological, and while I've never personally had a terminal illness, I did have a brief medical scare earlier this year that left me hospitalized for weeks. Long story short, I'd been having stomach pains for about a week, which turned out to be appendicitis. Now, I'm sure many of you know that generally speaking, getting your appendix removed is supposed to be a fairly easy surgery. Everything that I had looked into said that it's a type of thing that you spend maybe a day or two at most in the hospital for. Well, in my case, things went so wrong that I was in there for about 3 weeks and was told that I could die, and also had to leave the hospital with tubes coming out of my stomach that I had to leave in for another few weeks after that as well. Again, this is not at all anything like having an actual long-term terminal illness, but I did spend most of my time at the hospital scared, in pain, and alone. Not because my loved ones didn't want to come be with me, but because of how things worked out. They just weren't able to be there the entire time. I know how that sounds, but trust me, there wasn't any drama involved. It was just really unfortunate for everybody all around. But yeah, while I was there, I lost my sense of time and also generally felt really disgusting. I had a hard time doing anything on my own, and even just walking down the hallways was a challenge for what felt like way too long. Once I had those drainage tubes inserted into my lower abdomen, I really started to go downhill even further, mentally speaking, just due to how gross and uncomfortable that they were. Another thing that also really impacted me was that my ward in the hospital was actually right next to the oncology ward, and so I'd share common areas with cancer patients. And just as anyone would, being exposed to this made me think a lot about life and just how fragile it can all really be. It's not something I really got to see up close, even though my own estranged father passed away from the same illness just a few years ago. This was all a very long-winded way of saying that I feel like my time in the hospital, of being sick and also being around people who are suffering way worse, made me almost instantly relate to Mary's side of things. How she could be so angry at the world and lash out at her loved ones. How she could possibly get angry at her husband for something as innocent as bringing her flowers. And while James' actions in the end were totally unforgivable, it's also hard to not feel sorry for everyone involved here. Again, James really did and honestly still does seem to love Mary quite a lot, and to watch someone you cherish wither away, to watch them turn into someone else, while going through so much pain. I mean, there's absolutely a reason why so many people online seem to identify with the story more if they have personally had to take care of a loved one who was suffering from terminal illness. Being on either side of that equation is some of the most tragic stuff any human can ever endure. Even setting the illness aside, just growing apart from someone you love, no matter the reason, is something that can be incredibly traumatic. Upon reaching the conclusion of my first playthrough, I got the leave ending, which, from what I understand, is the most common. This is, of course, the ending where James and Mary are able to speak one last time, where James seems to fully admit the extent of his actions, including all the resentment that had built up for Mary while she was declining in health. Again, I felt I already got the full picture by the time I heard the hallway speech, but I was still shocked to hear James full-blown admit the level of resentment that he had for Mary after she got sick. This is the only ending where he just says that without any qualifiers or fluff. Mary forgives him, even challenging the notion that his actions were entirely malicious, but what this truly means in the end is still unclear, since it can be assumed that this version of Mary is still a figment of James' own imagination. The real Mary, of course, is still very much deceased, and unable to issue forgiveness even if she was inclined to do so. Again, regardless of all this, the moment James admits that he hated Mary and wanted his life back, for better or for worse, it's the most honest he seems this entire game, and it's heartbreaking for everyone involved. Then there's the in-water ending, which in a way feels more fitting considering the weight of what James has done. I'm not here to say which ending is more appropriate. In fact, one thing I find great about the leave ending here is that James literally presumably tries to leave Silent Hill in an attempt to carry on with life, but there's just something off about it. How exactly is James supposed to live given that he killed his wife? Is he supposed to hide this from law enforcement for the rest of his life, or would he have fessed up and gone straight to prison? While that probably would have been the most morally satisfying conclusion, it's also not at all a stretch that we're seeing James in this car at the end of the story. He doesn't flat out admit his resentment this time around, but some might argue that he's taking responsibility in a much more direct way in this version of events. The main thing that really stuck out to me about the in-water ending was the fact that James kept looking to the rear seat. I believe I even asked myself out loud what he kept focusing on, and that's when I remembered something from earlier in the game.
This place hasn't changed at all in 3 years.
Now, if you're an OG fan, you probably already know what I'm getting at, but I have also seen some old school fans who somehow haven't heard of this. It's said over and over again, right from the start, that Mary died 3 years ago, and yet when James gets to the Lakeview Hotel, he says this place hasn't changed in 3 years. So which one is it? Did Mary die 3 years ago after being hospitalized for an extended period of time? Or was she healthy enough to vacation in Silent Hill with James? By all accounts, their time in Silent Hill seemed happy, and also seemed to predate Mary's diagnosis. Now, skipping around a bit to the Maria ending, we also see this.
You really hated me. Didn't you?
It's true, I may have had some of those feelings. It was a long 3 years. I was so tired.
So this seems to imply that Mary was sick for 3 years. So again, which one is it? What I'm getting at is that James, talking to the backseat during the in-water ending, made me realize that Mary's body might be what he was looking back at. That she hadn't actually died 3 years ago, and instead was sick for 3 years before James killed her, and shortly thereafter drove with her body to Silent Hill in a state of complete denial, the infamous first stage of grief. After getting the in-water ending, I'd go on to get the other endings as well, including the rebirth ending in which James travels to a nearby island in an attempt to resurrect Mary. Again, he's talking to her directly here and seems to have her body under a sheet on the same boat with him. After getting these endings, I went and looked up the whole body in the back seat thing and realized that it was a debated topic for the last 20 years, and more or less confirmed, sort of, in the remake. Either way, if this is considered a remake-only thing is beside the point in my case, and nonetheless left me feeling speechless and floored by this twist that I honestly did not see coming at all. It's of course alluded to more in the Stillness ending, albeit maybe in a more poetic way. Stillness and In Water are almost identical, of course, and while I cannot say that I prefer one over the other, I think that the exchange between Mary and James here is honestly just some of the best I've seen in terms of acting, period. Not just in video games, I mean even compared to movies and all that. This ending just makes me want to ugly cry every single time.
I can't forgive myself for what I've done.
I know. What's wrong, honey?
I miss you so much. I am sorry. I am so sorry.
It's okay.
Now, back to the Maria ending. This one is oddly enough the most depressing ending, at least in my opinion. When James arrives on the rooftop, he's confronted by Mary, not Maria like in other endings. Here, Mary calls James out, and he only seems to take partial responsibility for what he did, making up excuses the whole time. After the Mary fight, James returns to find yet another resurrected version of Maria, which he attempts to leave Silent Hill with.
Better do something about that cough.
When I saw the achievement for getting this ending was called Vicious Circle, I felt entirely validated because that's really what this sequence felt like. It felt almost like an addict who refused to admit they have a problem, which I'm saying as someone who used to be one. It's this cycle of self-harm and destruction that's just never going to end unless you ultimately walk away from it. This isn't even getting into what happens once these two get into this car, because I'm not sure that Maria can even leave Silent Hill. And what's even more cruel here is that James is fully aware of what's going to happen. He knows what this cough means. He knows Maria is going to die a slow, painful death, just like Mary. Maybe even over and over again like we already saw in the game, for I don't know how long, probably as long as it takes for James to just stop. I know that I'm missing a lot of Maria lore, but this poor girl doesn't seem to even know who she is or why she even exists. And speaking of a vicious circle, I'm not sure if this is a weird comparison, but for me, the Rebirth ending feels sort of like the other side of the coin to the Maria ending. In this ending, James simply wants to undo his actions and bring Mary back to life, and while I don't know the deeper lore of Silent Hill, that sure sounds like a bad idea that is just bound to backfire. Again, this to me comes off like denial and unwillingness to accept that Mary is dead, and dead because of James himself, no less. You cannot bring the dead back to life, and if James lived to at least 2003 and watched FMA, he would have learned that exact lesson on his own. Before we talk about the last serious ending here, I want to talk about the two joke endings. There's not a lot to say here, I just love both of them. It's crazy to see some straight comedy after hours and hours of mental torture. I had to look up a guide on how to get the UFO ending because I don't know how anyone figures this out on their own. No clue. I love how the OG James barges in and takes Remake James away, but the dog ending is, of course, my absolute favorite between the two because how could you not love the slow turn?
Nie. To nie może być prawda.
Now, back to Pain and Despair. The last ending I wanted to discuss here is one of the new endings in the remake, the Bliss ending. You get this one by going to room 312 and drinking some White Claudia before watching the videotape. I wanted to avoid looking too deeply into White Claudia since I want to remain as spoiler-free as possible for whenever I play other Silent Hill games, but from what I understand, it's some kind of hallucinogen. Either way, in this ending, James goes to watch the tape and instead of cutting to Mary's death, it continues on as James and Mary embrace. Once the video ends, the camera pulls back to reveal that James is no longer in the room, presumably now sucked into this alternate world where he was once happy. Of course, as the name implies, now in a state of bliss, disconnected from the reality of it all. This ending gives me mixed feelings. For one, it's honestly kind of creepy as hell. I'm not sure why, but I always found it unsettling whenever characters sort of just get up and walk into a screen and disappear into a movie or a show. I think there's a Twilight Zone episode like that, and while I can't remember the details, that part always stuck with me. But aside from the creep factor, it's honestly kind of a happy and depressing conclusion at the same time. I mean, again, what can James really do aside from either die or spend the rest of his life in prison? You could view this as a prison of sorts, just devoid of suffering. Some might see that as unfair, but I don't really think that the fairness is really the question here. For me, it's more like, if I lost my spouse to terminal illness, would I want to live in a fantasy world where everything is great for the rest of eternity? I would suspect that most people would say yes. I think most people wish that they could return to a time when everything was okay, assuming you've been fortunate enough to have those times in the first place. On the other hand, though, this unreality is just that, a fantasy, and one that only exists because of how terrible things really ended up. It's messy, complicated, sad, horrifying, but still, overall, beautiful, and that's how I feel about the entire story of Silent Hill 2. I knew that I was going to get a good horror game, a great horror game even, but nothing could have prepared me for just how impactful of a narrative this was truly going to be. I think finding nuance and the gray area in characters is an insanely challenging thing to do, and somehow this game managed to walk this tightrope with such elegance that I will never not be entirely envious of the original Team Silent for coming up with all this. And I also have nothing but praise for Bloober for pulling off what seemed to be impossible. Trust me, I am now a lifelong Silent Hill fan, and I have a lot more that I could say about Silent Hill 2 Remake, but perhaps I'll save that for another time if and when it calls for it. I'm honored to have played this reimagined version of a horror classic, and I hope that this video was interesting, entertaining, and overall a good time from one fan of this work of art to another. And with all that said, I'll see you all in the next one.